Well, I want to thank in the first place Professor Kosold. Yeah, okay. It's a bit difficult for me to pronounce Danish. And I want to thank, of course, Professor Ditte Lindqvist and to the organizing committee of this wonderful conference. I'm very happy to be here with all of you and share these days with you. That was in the first place. In the second place, I have to apologize for my precarious English. That's really true. That's so. It's precarious. I have a sort of inhibition when it comes to speaking other languages different from my own mother tongue. I should need some psychological assistance for this. Well, I will go straight to the talk. Well, this is the title of the talk, and what is this? And I gave this title a long time ago when I began to work on this paper, on this communication. So it is not precisely what I'm going to talk about, but I think there is a close relationship. In preliminary terms, and from an experiential point of view, which is relevant for the status and modifications of subjectivity, acceleration is a space-shrinking and a time-stressing phenomenon. Assuming that this phenomenon has reached pervasiveness in late modernity, so that it has become determinative of social relations in general, a question about the impact that it has or may have on the structure of experience and of the subject of experience bears a double signification. On the one hand, it concerns temporality. It is the structure of the experience of time. And, on the other hand, it concerns historicity, that is, the structure of the experience of historical time. I suppose that the development of this question requires examining the structure of the experience of the present, given that acceleration may be considered at first sight as an intensive experience of the present. But then, an examination of the structure of the experience of the present is deeply rooted in the structure of the present itself. So my argument relates three concepts: experience, present, and acceleration, the latter according to the double effect in which this phenomenon appears: space-shrinking and time-stressing. Regarding this threefold relation, a relevant issue concerns the tolerance threshold of the subject of experience with respect to acceleration. You may recall some old, in some cases not so old, sci-fi movies in which the performers had to make a variety of extreme gestures in order to suggest the impact that an accelerating spaceship exerts on their bodies. Let us take this sort of bizarre pantomime as a hint pointing to that threshold. It could be argued, hypothetically, that the experience of acceleration strains the subject of experience to the point where experience founders in its sheer condition of possibility, meaning that there is a limit beyond which acceleration cannot be experienced as such, but, provided that the creature stands the test, only suffered as a kind of dull, continuous noise, or if you wish, of something of a still stand, a continuity of the same. Here, the threshold, the limit, is the thing that matters. If the experience of acceleration at its highest intensity limits with the very condition of possibility of experience, what could be this condition? To begin with, one cannot experience the condition of possibility of experience. This condition is a blind spot of experience, which is active in it, but never appropriable for experience at the moment of its presence, of its present. This condition, then, is a certain lapse, a leap, an interval, a lacuna that opens in the present of experience. You never experience the present of your experience. In this primary sense, experience is always a posteriori, nachträglich, après coup. The present of experience is something of a blow, a stroke. You don't feel the blow instantly. At the moment it hits, it has an anesthetic effect. According to this, the present of experience is necessarily disrupted in itself, and its structure is unavoidably determined by an intrinsic deferral. Without this structural deferral, there would be no past. There would not be past nor future, neither memory nor perception, neither thinking nor even the possibility of language. There would not be the possibility of relating to oneself nor of opening oneself to otherness. There would be no possibility at all. It could be argued, perhaps, that the striving for ever-increasing acceleration, as seen from the point of view of the subject, seeks anxiously precisely this, to remove any deferral, to make experience coincide with its condition, to bring it to a pure and simple present, which would mean the still stand of experience. Yet it may be a desperate search. In his preface to the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche states that we humans, like busy, laborious bees, are occupied only in bringing something home with neither heart nor ears for experiences. And he continues, on the contrary, like somebody divinely absent-minded and sunk in his own thoughts through the 12 strokes of midday, having just boomed into his ears, wakes with a start and wonders what hour struck. Sometimes we, too, afterwards rub our ears and ask, astonished, taken aback, what did we actually experience then? I return now to the question of acceleration. I'm inclined to believe that it is not possible to speak of acceleration as a fundamental and determining vector of modern and certainly late modern individual and social life, individual, social, and cultural life, without bringing complexity into view. In this sense, the essential character of modernity and of its present developments may be envisaged as a constant interplay between acceleration and complexity. Of course, this is nothing new, but the way to tackle the one or the other, both concepts at a time, is diverse beyond nuances. I confess that I am old-fashioned. Although much has been thought and said about the issue during the last century, my understanding of these two concepts owes much to Hölderlin and Hegel, or more generally to the consideration of the critical changes that occurred in the transition from the 18th to the 19th centuries. Reinhard Koselleck, for instance, speaks of a subtle period or subtle epoch. Both Hölderlin and Hegel had perhaps a most penetrating insight into the historical tendencies harbored by the forces to which both concepts and their interplay refer. In the following, I will address the question of acceleration, keeping in mind its interplay with complexity. Of course, a proper discussion of both concepts would exceed the limits of this communication. I will develop my considerations under diverse headings that I deem to be relevant in view of the times of acceleration and the acceleration of time that would characterize precisely our time. These headings will introduce two vignettes threaded by a question, a single question. What remains of experience in the times of acceleration? And this means, what is it that which persists of the subject of experience in such times? Would it be, if anything, a subject or someone or something definitively other? My first vignette, Dislocation. At the beginning of his first Bremen lecture of 1949 on Das Ding, the thing, in a short preamble entitled The Point of Reference, Martin Heidegger comments on the fact that all distances in time and space are shrinking, that's a quote. A vertiginous transformation of the relation of human beings to time and space is in course, according to his argument. And this transformation is essentially attributable to the multiple technological advances: radio, airplanes, film, recording apparatuses, television. However, this shrinking, quote, this hasty setting aside of all distances brings no nearness, end of quote, sentences Heidegger. He's implying that nearness is not something that you could probably measure by meter units or by inches or yards. Nearness is not touched by this abolition of distances. It remains outstanding, that is a quote, so that everything washes together into the uniformly distanceless. This pervading condition would be more uncanny, argues Heidegger, more uncanny, mehr unheimlich, argues Heidegger, than the bursting into pieces of everything that a nuclear war could bring about. In fact, the horrible, the atrocious, das Entsetzliche, the uprooting of everything that is, has already occurred. Following are the closing remarks of the preamble. The horrifying is what transposes, heraussetzt, all that is out of its previous essence. What is so horrifying? It reveals and conceals itself in the way that everything presences, namely that despite all overcoming of distance, the nearness of that which is remains outstanding. The expression das Entsetzliche is translated here as the horrifying. That is correct, but the noun means also displacement, dislocation, an abrupt removal, Heraussetzung, of something from its usual or proper site. And in this case, according to what Heidegger says, radically of everything, a removal that forecloses the access to the thing, not of course to the Kantian thing in itself, because this is part of the closure. The removal under consideration forecloses the access to the thing as thing. In this sense, it is properly uncanny, unheimlich, and there is a close proximity between the horrifying and the uncanny. With these implications, the preamble gives way to the lecture. And it is particularly interesting that, however emphatic the use of the word Entsetzliche is here, in the preamble, there is no trace of it in the following disquisition about the thing, unless we take the disquisition about it as a meditation on the nearness that remains outstanding, entsetzt, as a result of the technological shaping of experience in the modern world. Anyway, it could be said that the word das Entsetzliche, die Entsetzung, would be, in Heidegger's view, the proper name of what is at the same time the essence and the effect of the shrinking of all distances, let us say of acceleration. In this sense, it is a concept that deserves further interrogation under the characteristic of the forced structural disruption of the present. History. In terms of historical experience, it is perhaps the French Revolution what constitutes a decisive stage for the emergence of an explicit sense of acceleration. For good reasons, of course, since the French Revolution could not but be felt as an unprecedented acceleration of historical time. Events evolved one after another at a breathtaking pace, putting to the test the capacity of comprehension of everyone, including those who deemed themselves as the ones steering the whole process. But in fact, as seen from a broader point of view, this acute sense of acceleration of history epitomized a host of feelings and sensations experienced and of efforts done in order to keep up with multiple and disturbing changes occurring for more than a century in all fields of social and individual life. This keeping up indicates that it became more and more difficult for the subject to relate her own experience in a manner that could preserve untouched the innermost characteristics of a stable identity. The pace of changes began to be glaringly faster than the subject's ability to adapt to it, not to say to gain thorough control of it. In a certain way, Romanticism was the most acute response to this challenge. the dialectics of self-annihilation and self-creation, the supremely smart ruse of romantic irony, as Schlegel, for instance, deployed it, was for a fleeting moment the way to save the ego from its absorption in role and hostile objectivity. The revolution was a kind of Entsetzung, an abrupt displacement, a dislocation of all earthly things. Not just a temporal displacement, nor a spatial dislocation, but a spatial-temporal disruption, a collapse at once of the place in its present and of the present in its place, which in its core maintains a sort of strange imbalance. Strange because it is this very imbalance which stabilizes at any moment the driving force of the disruption of historical experience and of the subject of the subject's sense of historical time. Language. There were symptoms of the most diverse nature and in the most diverse fields. Take, for instance, language. In an article published in the Tatler, 1710, the alleged author of an epistle that is reproduced by the alleged Isaac Bickerstaff Esquire, one of the many monikers of Jonathan Swift, complains about, quote, the great depravity of our taste and the continual corruption of our style. The core of the corruption is the extended practice of abbreviating words by the elision of vowels, the contraction of consonants, the reduction of two syllables to one, and more severe mutilations which increase the overload of monosyllables, which are the disgrace of our language, says Bickerstaff. It is a kind of linguistic entropy, a regression that threatens to dissipate the word in the last whisper at a short distance of the most extreme linguistic project at the Academy of Lagado, third voyage of Gulliver's Travels, directed to the total suppression of language in favor of a communication by way of things. Not a proper communication, you would say, but a commodification. It is Swift's critique of the moderns as seen from the dominant satirical side of his writing. This critique, in what concerns language, has its very center in the repudiation of the capitalistic structuration of all social relations in the kingdom led by the moneyed class. In this sense, it seems sound to say that the Swiftian critique is taking sides with the ancients against the moderns, inasmuch as it concerns the changes of the English tongue, points towards the transition from the countryside to the city. And of course, the place of the moneyed class is the city, not the rural areas. The city narrows the relations between human beings. The market, as its fundamental reality urges, sets them in emergency. The linguistic result of such narrowing and urgency is a subordination of language to the same principle that governs economy. Language must submit to the rules and requirements of business. It has to become a language of the market, so that its possible nuances and ambiguities do not distract partners from the ends to which it has to ancillary serve. The definitive scope of a totally urbanized society would be the erasure of language. For economic exchange would be total exchange of meaning, and of one and only one univocal meaning. Money would replace the word. In contradistinction to this, as seen from Swift's critical point of view, the countryside characterizes itself by extension and leisure as spacing of production and business, whose proper expression is the ample phrase, the polysyllabic expansion of words, the vocalic opening. And there is more. For precisely this expansion and leisure makes possible to share the word without the interests of each one being immediately compromised. They make conversation possible. In the end, as seen from this conservative point of view of Swift, in the end, the shortening, the mutilation of words, and the promptness and efficiency of exchanges is a pressing demand that the determination of social relations by economic interests makes on the forms by which those relations used to be exercised in the common space of communication and linguistic exchange. Fate. Let's linger still a while on language, but this time considering its poetic articulation. The most conscious of all modern poets, Friedrich Hölderlin, I mentioned him, had the sharpest sense for the changes that language, that is, human life itself, suffers under the prevailing epochal forces, which are indeed complex and essentially contrasting. This means that, as a modern poet, Hölderlin had the most penetrating perception of the destitute condition of the poet and of poetry itself in the context of modernity. His testimony about this condition anticipated Hegel's sentence, according to which art has ceased in modern times to keep up with the spirit's interests and exigencies. I will return to this in a moment. Though Hölderlin's essential concern was to secure for today's poets a bourgeois existence, a civil existence, in a sort of implicit allusion to Plato's exclusion of the poets from the polis, which, as condemnation of the arts of appearance and deception, would be a sign of the philosopher's commitment to truth. The forced securing of the poet's existence in bourgeois, that is, modern society, depends on a consideration of the condition that made poetry originally possible precisely as a primordial mode of truth in the Greek world. In this sense, what is needed is to take, quote, into account the difference of times and institutions in order to elevate poetry today to the mechane of the ancients. This mechane, this eminent technique, consists in a lawful calculation, in the law of calculus. The central problem of modern, on Hölderlin's terms, Shakespearean poetry is that its prosody is unstable, that it lacks the law of calculus. The lawful calculation, which was the admirable feat of the Greeks, is not at hand for the modern poet, and even if a certain technique were at her disposal, there is no guarantee that it could consistently accomplish the task of calculation, which has to do with what is in itself incalculable, the living meaning, existence itself. The tones, which are forms of life, tragic, epic, and lyric, are accelerating, says Hölderlin. This imposes a poetological reflection that has in its core the question of measure and the poetic knowledge that, quote, each one nonetheless has its measure, end of quote. That is, that each one blossoms in the language of its own, which is the task of the poem to greet and to harbor. This knowledge has the character of memory, a remembrance, Andenken, that remembers each one to itself, inasmuch as each one owes herself to each other. Complexity. Hegel was a thinker of complexity in many ways, and of course the Hegelian dialectics is the overarching systematic operation that deals with complexity in all of its dimensions and manifestations. For the present purpose, I'm particularly interested in one of the many relationships in which these dimensions and manifestations make their power felt. I mean, it is precisely what characterizes the modern world in a certain sense by contrast. I mean, the end of great art, that is, of the power of art to respond to the highest interest of the spirit. This power consists in the capacity of bringing worldly relations, circumstances, events, and behaviors to a higher, purer, truer level by the work and effect of fantasy, of imaginal representation. For Hegel, the point is that this capacity is no longer able to undertake the elaboration and clarification of those relations in correspondence to the challenge that they pose to the spirit in present times. Such relations have become complex, specified and stratified in multiple ways. So the spirit has to resort to other dispositions of its own, definitively abandoning the noble epoch of, allow me to phrase it this way, the imaginary management of reality in its actual life and work. By virtue of this abandonment, art is consigned to the past of the spirit, no matter if it may improve and refine its performance and outputs in the future. The present of a new epoch demands an activity absolutely different. Sober judgment, penetrating scientific knowledge, the effectiveness of general laws, and, in essential terms, the limitless unfolding of a reflection that has to take charge of concrete reality and its over-determined diversity and pervade it with its constant operation. Nevertheless, a certain complexity escaped Hegel's indisputable acumen. And it was a rather obvious one. It was the new complexity of a new form of life, whose flagrant evidence is the hustle and bustle of the modern city. There is a letter from Hegel to his wife reporting his first impression of Paris, which have Hegel's long acquaintance with his beloved Berlin as background. Taking his first sightseeing of this capital of the civilized world, he evokes the Zelten in Berlin on passing in front of some Parisian cafes, but with a proviso that they host 10 times as many people at the tables. As I go through the streets, the people look just the same as in Berlin. Everyone dressed the same, about the same faces, the same appearance, yet in a populous mass. It is true that Paris was still at that time a city that displayed abundant remnants of its medieval past, but Hegel's statement betrays a certain blindness of him, not being capable to grasp the difference that an incomparably greater number of people may entail in this case. This number, observable in the streets and public places, announces the advent of a different type of city, the modern city, and with it an essential different type of subject, which is substantially determined by the city itself. The crowded city is also a city where people are caught in the rush of a feverish activity, no matter that this activity is aimed at filling idle hours, just at wasting time. City. The fundamental experience of the modern city was primarily coined by Charles Baudelaire. It is an experience of rapid change and of the weight of memory that counterbalances the haste. The Tableau Parisien, Parisian scenes, second part of The Flowers of Evil, and the Spleen de Paris bear witness to this experience. But there is perhaps no other place in Baudelaire's oeuvre than a couple of verses of Le Cygne, the Swan, the fourth piece of the scenes, which can give to the sense of change the most compelling expression. Le vieux Paris n'est plus, la forme d'une ville change plus vite, hélas, que le cœur d'un mortel. The old Paris is gone, the form of a city takes more quickly shifts, alas, than does the mortal heart. It is, of course, a transformation of medieval Paris, mainly on the right bank of the Seine, where the places to which Baudelaire refers in his poems are, by Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann in the middle of the 19th century. There is no possibility for the beats of the heart of a mortal to keep pace with the irresistible transformation of Baudelaire's city. But this heart, wounded by the abolition of so many familiar places and scenes, the old Parisian scenes, opposes the gravity of its memory. Paris change, mais rien dans ma mélancolie n'a bougé. Palais neuf, échafaudage bloc, vieux faubourg, tout pour moi devient allégorie, et mes chers souvenirs sont plus lourds que des rocs. Paris may change, but in my melancholy mood nothing has budged. New palaces, blocks, scaffoldings, old neighborhoods are allegorical for me, and my dear memories are heavier than stone. The Swan is dedicated to Victor Hugo, who at the time was banished and had to remain in Guernsey, one of the so-called Anglo-Norman Isles or Channel Isles, according respectively to the French or the British denomination. It is perhaps the greatest poem of exile ever written, and in fact it deploys a gallery of unfortunate figures that share this melancholy fate. Andromache, the wretched swan longing for its native lake, Ovid's man painfully stretching the head towards the sky, the consumptive negress, the orphans, the sailors left forgotten in an island, the captives, the defeated, many others more. This is the last verse of the poem. The captives, the defeated, many others more. All of this, in a first instance, are called as witnesses to a condition that is entirely new, but at the same time awaken things immemorial, which resist this condition by their own fragility and their abandonment to the forces that call them back. In this sense, more decisively, they are the figures of memory. And certainly, it is a radical experience of the emergence of an unfathomable memory as a sort of gravitational pull exerted on the subject, not by the past in a merely chronological sense, but by her finitude. The specificity of this memory is expressed at the very beginning of the poem. Andromaque, je pense à vous. Andromache, I think of you. I think of you is, of course, I remember you. Je me souviens de vous. But what is decisive is to hear this penser à, je pense à vous. penser, to think of, as a modification, a modalization, if I may, of the Cartesian I think, je pense, ego cogito, which takes place in a supposedly pure present. This little is what evinces an undeniable fracture, a hiatus in the present. It is a gravitational weak force that separates the present from itself, at the same time that it makes this present possible, and also its past and the future beyond conjecture. Any haste, no matter how marginal, any acceleration of the pace of life awakens the little and the unending memory hidden in it. And the haste itself is nothing but the desperate flight from the non-disposable sediments that this memory reminds and brings to the present as a pending present. You might call that an apparent force which disrupts the presence from itself and Setzung. Society. Preceding my vignette on the city, it seems to me that it would have been on the line to have society in the sequence. It is another guess of mine that this option should have led us to discuss things that deserve a more patient attention. However, I cannot leave unsaid something that relates to my last notes about the experience of the Baudelarian subject. I was referring to the haste that characterizes the modern city. This haste is a flight, I was saying, and the flight is the mode and the essence of the accelerated movement of modern society. To accelerate is to run away. But in running away, there should not remain anything of that wherefrom one runs away. The more accelerated the runaway, the more intense the momentum of the flight, the more it drags with itself all those forms and ways, customs and relations that were current until they dissipate under the force of the gale in the density of a new air. This density owes to the many relics that in a somewhat more ethereal way remain now in the air we breathe and absorb. I keep in mind the famous passage of the Communist Manifesto that speaks of the restlessness of the bourgeoisie. That is a quote, constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. But I stop here and make haste for the sake of time. Just one vignette more. Wind. In the Meridian, the discourse of acceptance of the Georg Büchner Prize, pronounced on 22 October 1960 by Paul Celan, whom it is apt to consider the greatest poet of the German language in the 20th century, one reads a passage that speaks about the poem that in its turn speaks on its own behalf, but at the same time and in a certain sense the poem that has always sought the hope of speaking on behalf of a totally other, I'm quoting. Yet this is not a granted expectation. Indeed, a hope is precisely this, a non-granted expectation, a hypothesis. It is a thought of the heart, a thought that opens towards what thought cannot preconceive, a possible thought that freely rests on its own possibility, which would be the present condition of the poem. Here is the passage. The poem tarries and tests the wind, a word related to the creaturely, through such thoughts. Nobody can tell how long the breath pause, the testing, and the thought will last. The swift, which has always been outside, has gained speed. The poem knows this, but heads straight for that other that it considers reachable, able to be set free, perhaps vacant, and thus turned, let's say, like Lucille, turned toward it, the poem. The word swift translates das Geschwinde, the fast, the speedy, that which moves and pushes in a rush. There is no explanation of what is that to which this swift refers, but it seems clear that it alludes to an all-embracing phenomenon, a global phenomenon, if you wish. Celan is evoking a passage from Wojciech, the marvelous play by Büchner. In the passage, the captain asks Wojciech about the weather. Wojciech answers, bad, Herr Hauptmann, bad, wind. And the captain adds, I can feel it already, there's something of a speed, it's sowas Geschwindes out there. A wind like that has an effect on me like a mouse. You could say in German, der geschwinde Wind, the swift wind, the wind of swiftness, the wind that swiftness is. In fact, it would be said, it is the wind that nowadays blows everywhere. Perhaps the Benjaminian wind that blows from paradise, which prevents the angel of history from making a halt and mending all things broken. Perhaps it is the wind that the creature, the most vulnerable of all things, tests, bearing in its tremulous scenting testimony to its own fragility. This wind, this swiftness, blows now and hurries everywhere, provided that everywhere is always outside, out there. Duplicity, this is not a vignette, this is some sort of conclusion. Celan, with whom the modern poetic insight firstly deployed by Hölderlin may have come to its consummation due to overwhelming personal and historical experiences, was a poet of a double Geschwindigkeit, of a double uncanniness, a double Unheimlichkeit. This double uncanniness, if we follow Celan's argument and the meridian, is the one that separates and at the same time tends to confuse art and poetry. That is, technology and the poem. For art, techne is a secret force that drives Western history, global history today, in an ever more rapid pace. Despite the seeming close proximity between this consideration and Heidegger's stance, as I tried to sketch it earlier, a crucial difference subsists, since Heidegger wants to maintain the ultimately separated art and technology in favor of art. For Celan, there is a strangeness that art relentlessly fosters, bringing everything under its mastery. In the end, the Holocaust cannot be neatly separated from the sacred German art, as Celan's early poem Death Fugue implies. There is this strangeness, then, but there is still another strangeness to which the poem opens itself. And this one is improbable advent of a farther other that resists any compulsory assimilation. Correspondingly, a double acceleration prevails. On the one hand, the forcefully one that doesn't spare anything nor anyone who cannot keep its space, searching to coincide absolutely with its present. And on the other hand, the one that the poem exerts at times, as Celan says, which are other present times always. La poésie, elle aussi brûle nos étapes, Celan writes. Poetry too burns our steps. Poetry means here existence, an existence that runs towards an encounter, at the same time that it remains mindful, eingedenk bleibt, of its dates. It is of that which separates one present from another. In the eye of the storm of unbounded and irrepressible acceleration, and within the abyssal place of uncanniness, which is one with the feral, there is the need to discern one wind from another, one present from the other. One present is the dull, incessantly varying and escalating continuity of the same. The other present is an opening to the improbable and unforeseeable advent of a farther other, another experience, the experience of another, that just by its possible and impossible imminence, by its coming, brings disruption, and with it the present of another present, a present to come. This other experience is the work of memory. It is its work in Hölderlin's, Baudelaire's, and Celan's certainly different but mutually reverberating senses. Andenken, penser à, eingedenk bleiben. Thank you.